October 17, 2006. The date remains etched in the memory of Millbrook Avenue like a scar that never quite healed. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it would come to represent. The last day anyone saw 12-year-old Marcus Chen walking home from Riverside Middle School, his navy backpack bouncing against his small frame as he navigated the familiar sidewalks of suburban Connecticut. The morning had begun like countless others in the quiet neighborhood of Eastfield. Maple trees lined the street in perfect rows, their leaves painting the October sky in brilliant oranges and deep reds. The air carried that crisp autumn scent, a mixture of dying leaves, wood smoke from distant chimneys, and the faint sweetness of Mrs. Patterson's apple pie cooling on her windowsill. It was the kind of morning that made residents pause while retrieving their newspapers, breathing deeply and feeling grateful for the peaceful life they'd built in this corner of America. Marcus had eaten his usual breakfast of chocolate chip waffles, while his mother, Linda, packed his lunch with the methodical care of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. His father, David, an accountant at a firm in Hartford, had already left for his morning commute, but not before ruffling his son's black hair and reminding him about soccer practice after school. These small, ordinary moments would later be dissected and treasured, each gesture becoming precious in hindsight. The boy's routine was as predictable as clockwork. He would walk the 8 blocks to school along Millbrook Avenue, turn left on Pine Street, cross at the traffic light by Henderson's Pharmacy, and arrive at the red brick building that housed Riverside Middle School by 7:45 a.m. sharp. After school, he would reverse the journey, often stopping at the small corner store owned by Mr. Powell Antonelli to buy a pack of baseball cards or a candy bar with his weekly allowance. That Tuesday afternoon, Marcus had attended all his classes. His math teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, would later tell police that he seemed normal, perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but nothing that raised concern. He had turned in his history report on the Revolutionary War, a project he'd worked on for weeks, complete with hand-drawn maps and carefully researched battle timelines. During lunch, he sat with his usual group of friends, Tommy, Jake, and Alex, boys who shared his passion for baseball cards and video games. The last confirmed sighting came from Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from the Chens. She was tending to her garden, pulling the last of the season's tomatoes from their vines, when she noticed Marcus walking past at approximately 3:42 p.m. He waved to her as he always did, a small gesture that had become part of their unspoken routine over the years. Mrs. Hartwell would replay this moment countless times in the months that followed, searching for any detail she might have missed, any sign that something was amiss. If this story moves you deeply, you might want to subscribe and stay with us for more stories that matter. Marcus never made it home that day. When 4:30 p.m. came and went without his familiar footsteps on the front porch, Linda Chen felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. By 5 p.m., she was calling the school. By 5:30 p.m., she was driving the route between home and school, her hands gripping the steering wheel as her eyes scanned every sidewalk, every alley, every shadow where a 12-year-old boy might be hiding or hurt. The police arrived at 6:15 p.m., their patrol car's presence transforming the quiet street into something ominous. Officer Patricia Reeves, a 15-year veteran of the Eastfield Police Department, took the initial report with the practiced calm of someone who had handled dozens of missing person cases. Most of them, she knew, ended with sheepish children returning home after losing track of time at a friend's house or getting distracted by some adventure. But as the hours stretched into evening, and then into night, the routine questioning took on a different urgency. The search began in earnest the following morning. Volunteers arrived before dawn, clutching thermoses of coffee and wearing the grim expressions of people who understood they were looking for someone's worst nightmare. They formed search parties that combed through Millbrook Park, the wooded area behind the school, the construction site where new houses were being built on Oakdale Street. Dogs were brought in, their handlers guiding them along Marcus's usual route, hoping to catch a scent that might lead somewhere anywhere. The Chen family's 2-story colonial house became a command center of sorts. Linda sat by the phone, jumping each time it rang, hoping against hope that it would be Marcus calling to say he was safe, that there had been some terrible misunderstanding. David took leave from work, spending his days walking the neighborhoods, showing Marcus's school photo to anyone who would look. Store clerks, postal workers, joggers in the park. The picture showed a boy with bright, intelligent eyes and a gap-toothed smile, wearing the navy blue polo shirt that was part of Riverside Middle School's uniform. Days turned into weeks. The yellow ribbons that neighbors had tied around trees began to fade in the autumn rain. The search parties grew smaller as the initial surge of community support gave way to the grinding reality that Marcus Chen seemed to have simply vanished. Police interviewed hundreds of people, classmates, teachers, neighbors, strangers, who might have been in the area that Tuesday afternoon. They examined security footage from the few businesses along Marcus's route, studied traffic patterns, followed up on dozens of tips that led nowhere. The media attention was intense but brief. Local news stations ran stories about the missing boy, his photograph appearing on television screens across Connecticut. National outlets picked up the story for a day or two before moving on to other tragedies. But for the residents of Millbrook Avenue, the disappearance became a permanent fixture in their daily lives, a shadow that fell across every ordinary moment. As winter settled over Eastfield, transforming the search area into a landscape of frozen ground and bare branches, the investigation began to lose momentum. The FBI had been called in, their resources adding weight to the effort, but without witnesses, without physical evidence, without any clear direction to pursue, even their expertise could only accomplish so much. The case remained active, but it was no longer the priority it had been in those frantic first weeks. The Chen family's life was forever altered. Linda quit her job as a dental hygienist to focus entirely on the search for her son. David aged years in the span of months, his hair going grey at the temples as he struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy while living with the unbearable uncertainty. They appeared on talk shows, granted interviews to newspapers and magazines, anything that might keep Marcus's face in the public eye. But as the months passed, the world's attention inevitably moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other families facing their own unthinkable circumstances. The seasons changed, but on Millbrook Avenue time seemed suspended in that October afternoon when Marcus Chen had waved to Mrs. Hartwell and then vanished into the autumn air. Spring arrived with its usual promises of renewal, daffodils pushing through the last patches of snow, maple trees budding with tender green leaves, but the neighborhood carried its scar like a visible wound that refused to heal. By the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, the yellow ribbons had mostly disappeared, taken down by weather and the passage of time. Some residents had replaced them with small blue ribbons. Blue had been Marcus's favorite color, but even these gestures felt inadequate against the magnitude of what had been lost. The Chen family organized a memorial service in Millbrook Park, the same park where search parties had combed through every inch of undergrowth and walked every trail. About 60 people attended, their faces bearing the worn expressions of a community that had learned to live with unanswered questions. Linda Chen stood at the small podium, her voice steady despite the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks. She spoke about her son's laugh, the way he would practice his baseball swing in the backyard until well past sunset, his dream of becoming a veterinarian because he couldn't stand to see any creature in pain. David stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his own words caught somewhere in his throat. They thanked the community for not forgetting, for keeping Marcus alive in their memories and their hearts. But beneath the surface of this public solidarity, the disappearance had begun to fracture the neighborhood in ways both subtle and profound. Some families became overprotective, no longer allowing their children to walk to school alone or play outside without constant supervision. The simple freedom that had once defined childhood in Eastfield, the ability to ride bikes until streetlights came on, to explore the woods behind the development, to feel safe in the familiar rhythms of small-town life, had been irretrievably lost. Others responded with a kind of determined normalcy, as if refusing to change their routines might somehow undo what had happened. They continued to let their children walk to school, maintained their evening jogs through the neighborhood, kept their doors unlocked during the day. But even these gestures of defiance carried an undercurrent of fear, a heightened awareness of every unfamiliar car, every stranger who lingered too long in the park. The house at 247 Millbrook Avenue, where the Chens lived, became a different kind of landmark. People would slow their cars as they passed, not out of voyeuristic curiosity, but with a sort of respectful acknowledgement of the tragedy that had touched this ordinary home. Some neighbors made excuses to walk by, hoping to catch a glimpse of Linda or David, to offer a smile or a wave that might somehow bridge the distance between those who had lost everything and those who lived in constant fear that they might be next. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had taken over the case from Officer Reeves, made regular visits to the Chen home. She was a methodical woman in her early 40s, a mother herself, who understood that keeping hope alive was sometimes the only thing standing between a family and complete despair. She would sit at the kitchen table where Marcus had once eaten his chocolate chip waffles, updating the Chens on any new leads, no matter how small or unlikely they might be. Most of these leads led nowhere. A construction worker thought he remembered seeing a boy matching Marcus's description near a job site in the next town, but security footage proved he had been mistaken about the date. A teacher from a school district 40 miles away was certain she had seen Marcus in her classroom, but the boy turned out to be a new student who bore only a superficial resemblance. A psychic from New York claimed to have visions of Marcus trapped in a basement somewhere, surrounded by water. But when pressed for specifics, her descriptions became vague and contradictory. The investigation had expanded and contracted like breathing. At its peak, more than 50 law enforcement officers from various agencies had been involved. They had searched abandoned buildings, drained ponds, examined every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius. They had interviewed Marcus's teachers going back to kindergarten, tracked down every delivery driver and maintenance worker who had been in the neighborhood that day, followed up on reports of suspicious vehicles that had been seen in the area during the weeks leading up to his disappearance. As the second year began, the resources dedicated to the case inevitably diminished. Detective Martinez still worked the case actively, but she was juggling other investigations, other families in crisis. The FBI had shifted their focus to more recent cases with fresher leads. The reward fund, which had grown to nearly $50,000 through community donations and fundraising events, remained unclaimed. The Chen family's marriage began to show the strain. Linda threw herself into advocacy work, connecting with other families of missing children, attending conferences on child safety, lobbying for changes in how quickly Amber Alerts could be issued. David, by contrast, seemed to turn inward, spending long hours in Marcus's room reading his son's books, playing his video games, as if trying to understand something about the boy he had somehow missed. They went to counseling, both together and separately. Dr. Patricia Wong, a grief counselor who specialized in ambiguous loss, the particularly cruel form of grief that comes with not knowing what has happened to a loved one, helped them understand that their different ways of coping were normal, even necessary. Linda needed to act, to feel that she was doing something constructive with her pain. David needed to remember, to keep Marcus present in the most intimate and personal way possible. The neighborhood adapted around their trauma. Patterson, the woman who had been known for her apple pies, started leaving covered dishes on the Chen family's porch twice a week. Mr. Antonelli, who owned the corner store where Marcus had bought his baseball cards, kept a small framed photograph of the boy behind the cash register and refused to take it down, even when some customers complained that it made them uncomfortable. Mrs. Hartwell planted a small garden in her front yard in Marcus's memory, choosing flowers that would bloom in cycles throughout the year so that there would always be something growing, something alive and beautiful, in the space where she had last seen him. The seasons continued their relentless cycle. Halloween came and went with fewer trick-or-treaters than in previous years. Thanksgiving dinner tables held one empty chair in spirit, if not in reality. Christmas lights seemed less bright. New Year's resolutions felt hollow when the biggest hope was simply for answers, for closure, for any kind of resolution to the questions that haunted every quiet moment. By the third anniversary, the memorial service was smaller, attended mostly by immediate neighbors and a few of Marcus's former classmates who had grown 3 years older while he remained frozen at 12 in everyone's memory. Linda and David had learned to navigate their grief in public, to accept condolences gracefully, to update concerned friends and family members on the status of the investigation without breaking down completely. But in private, in the quiet moments when they thought no one was looking, the weight of not knowing pressed down on them like a physical force. They had learned to live with uncertainty, but they had never learned to accept it. Every day brought the possibility that today might be the day they finally got answers. Every phone call might be the one that changed everything. Every knock on the door might bring news that would either restore their world or shatter what remained of it. 5 years after Marcus Chen's disappearance, Millbrook Avenue had settled into a new kind of normal, one shaped by absence, by the persistent ache of questions that refused to fade. The neighborhood still bore the invisible scars of that October day, but life, with its relentless forward momentum, had begun to reassert itself in small, tentative ways. New families had moved in, drawn by the same quiet streets and good schools that had once attracted the Chens. These newcomers learned about Marcus gradually, through whispered conversations at school pickup lines and community meetings where his name was still invoked whenever discussions turned to neighborhood safety. To them, the tragedy was historical, something that had happened before their time, but they could see its effects in the way established residents still watched their children more carefully, still locked their doors during the day, still felt a small chill when walking past 247 Millbrook Avenue. The Chen family had found ways to carry their grief that allowed them to function, if not quite to thrive. Linda had become a powerful advocate for missing children, testifying before state legislators about the need for faster response times in child abduction cases, working with police departments to improve their protocols for the crucial first hours after a child disappears. Her work gave shape to her pain, transforming the helplessness she felt about Marcus into action that might help other families avoid the same nightmare. David had returned to his accounting practice, but his colleagues noticed changes in him that went beyond the obvious marks of grief. He had become more patient with difficult clients, more willing to listen to the small dramas that once would have seemed trivial. His experience with loss had given him a different perspective on what truly mattered, though this wisdom had come at a price no one would willingly pay. They had kept Marcus's room exactly as it was, despite well-meaning suggestions from family members that they might find some peace in packing away his belongings. His baseball glove still sat on the dresser where he had left it, the leather darkening with age. His homework assignments, including that Revolutionary War report he had turned in on his last day, remained stacked neatly on his desk. The room had become a shrine, but also an anchor, a physical space where their son's presence still felt tangible and real. Detective Martinez, now a lieutenant, still carried the case with her, though the active investigation had inevitably wound down. She kept Marcus's file on her desk, and every few months she would spend a day following up on old leads or reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes. Technology had advanced since 2006. New databases were available, DNA testing had become more sophisticated, and social media had created new ways for missing persons to be found. But despite these tools, Marcus Chen remained as much of a mystery as he had been on that first night when his parents called the police. The reward fund had grown to nearly $75,000, sustained by annual fundraising events and the persistent generosity of a community that refused to forget. Each October, on the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, a memorial walk was held, starting at Riverside Middle School and ending at Millbrook Park. The participants had changed over the years. Some of the original neighbors had moved away, taking their memories and their grief to new cities and new lives. But the core group remained constant, bound together by their shared experience of loss and their refusal to let Marcus become just another cold case file. Mrs. Hartwell, now in her 80s, had become the unofficial keeper of the neighborhood's memory. She still maintained the memorial garden she had planted for Marcus, and visitors would often find her there in the early morning hours, tending to the flowers and talking quietly to herself, or perhaps to someone only she could see. Her garden had become a place of pilgrimage for other families dealing with missing children, a spot where they could sit quietly and feel understood without having to explain their pain to anyone. The physical landscape of the neighborhood had changed in small ways. The construction site on Oakdale Street, where search parties had once looked for any trace of Marcus, had been completed, and young families now lived in the houses that had been just wooden frames on that October day in 2006. Henderson's Pharmacy, where Marcus had crossed the street twice daily on his way to and from school, had been renovated, its familiar green awning replaced with modern glass and steel that somehow made the whole block feel less friendly, less safe. But it was the psychological landscape that had been most profoundly altered. Parents who had once sent their children out to play with casual confidence now felt a low-level anxiety whenever their kids were out of sight. The simple act of a child being 10 minutes late from school could trigger panic attacks and frantic phone calls. Summer afternoons, which had once been filled with the sounds of children playing in yards and riding bikes through the streets, became quieter, more supervised, more careful. Some families had left Millbrook Avenue entirely, unable to reconcile their need for normalcy with the daily reminder of what had happened to Marcus. The Johnsons, who had lived 2 houses down from the Chens, moved to Arizona after their own son started having nightmares about disappearing. The Kowalskis relocated to Maine, where Mr. Kowalski had taken a job that he might not have considered before Marcus vanished, before the neighborhood stopped feeling like the safe haven they had believed it to be. But others had stayed, bound together by their shared experience and their determination not to let fear win. They had organized neighborhood watches, created phone trees for emergencies, established protocols for keeping track of each other's children during after-school hours. These practical measures helped, but they couldn't address the deeper change that had occurred, the loss of innocence, the knowledge that terrible things could happen anywhere, to anyone, without warning or explanation. The seasons continued their cycle, each one marking another passage of time without answers. Marcus would have been 17 now, a junior in high school, probably playing varsity baseball, thinking about college applications, learning to drive. His parents tried not to dwell on these milestones, but they were impossible to ignore completely. They saw boys who would have been his classmates growing into young men, saw their friends posting proud photos of proms and graduations and first jobs, and felt the acute pain of all the moments they would never share with their son. The case had generated its share of theories over the years. Some believed Marcus had been abducted by someone he knew, someone who had been watching him, learning his routine, waiting for the right moment. Others thought he had encountered a stranger who had acted impulsively, taking advantage of an opportunity that had presented itself on that quiet Tuesday afternoon. A few wondered if he had run away deliberately, though this seemed unlikely given his close relationship with his parents and his lack of any obvious problems at school or at home. Detective Martinez had explored all these possibilities and more. She had interviewed registered sex offenders, tracked down every suspicious character who had been reported in the area, followed up on sightings from across the country. She had worked with FBI profilers who had created psychological portraits of the likely perpetrator, analyzed patterns of similar crimes, mapped out geographical areas where Marcus might have been taken. But despite all this effort, all this expertise, all this determination, Marcus Chen remained missing. As the 10th anniversary approached, the investigation was officially reclassified as a cold case, though Detective Martinez promised the Chen family that this was just a bureaucratic designation and wouldn't affect her personal commitment to finding answers. The local newspaper ran a retrospective article, interviewing neighbors and family members about how the disappearance had changed their lives. The story was picked up by a few national outlets, generating a brief resurgence of public interest and a handful of new tips that, like all the others, ultimately led nowhere. 15 years had passed since that October afternoon when Marcus Chen vanished from Millbrook Avenue, and the neighborhood had evolved in the way that all places do when enough time passes to blur the sharp edges of even the most profound tragedies. Young families had moved in, attracted by the well-maintained homes, the mature trees that lined the streets, and the top-rated school district. These new residents knew about Marcus. It was impossible to live on Millbrook Avenue without learning the story eventually, but for them it was history rather than lived experience, a sad chapter that belonged to the past rather than something that shaped their daily lives. The house at 253 Millbrook Avenue, directly across from where the Chens still lived, had been sold 3 times since 2006. The latest owners were Michael and Jennifer Walsh, a couple in their early 30s who had moved from Boston with their 2 young daughters. Michael worked in marketing for a tech company, his job allowing him the flexibility to work from home most days. Jennifer was a freelance graphic designer who had converted the upstairs spare bedroom into a light-filled studio where she created logos and websites for small businesses throughout Connecticut. The Walshes had been drawn to the neighborhood by its obvious stability and charm. The houses were well maintained, the lawns meticulously cared for, the streets clean and safe-feeling. During their initial visit with their real estate agent, they had noticed an unusual quietness for a family neighborhood. Fewer children playing outside than they might have expected, parents who seemed to keep a closer eye on their kids than was typical in suburban Connecticut. But they attributed this to changing times, to the general increase in parental caution that had become common everywhere. It was only after they had signed the lease that their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, gently told them about Marcus. She did it carefully, with the sensitivity of someone who had had this conversation many times over the years, explaining that she felt they should know, not to frighten them, but so they would understand the context of certain things they might notice. The way Linda Chen sometimes stood at her living room window for long periods, watching the street, the small garden that Mrs. Hartwell maintained in Marcus's memory, the reason why some of the older residents seemed particularly protective of the neighborhood's children. Michael and Jennifer had different reactions to this information. Jennifer felt a deep sadness for the Chen family and a maternal protectiveness toward her own daughters that made her want to drive them to school rather than let them walk, even though she knew logically that Marcus's disappearance 15 years ago had no bearing on their current safety. Michael, meanwhile, found himself curious about the case in a way that surprised him. He had always been drawn to mysteries, to puzzles that needed solving, and something about the story of Marcus Chen captured his imagination in a way that felt both respectful and compulsive. Over the weeks that followed their move, Michael began to research the case obsessively. He read every newspaper article he could find online, studied the photographs that had been published over the years, traced the timeline of the investigation through police reports that had been made public. He learned about the massive search effort, the hundreds of interviews, the thousands of tips that had been followed up but led nowhere. He studied maps of the neighborhood, trying to understand how a 12-year-old boy could simply vanish from such a safe, well-populated area in the middle of the afternoon. His interest wasn't ghoulish or voyeuristic. Michael genuinely wanted to help, to see if 15 years of distance might allow him to spot something that others had missed. He had a background in data analysis from his marketing work, and he approached the case with the methodical mindset of someone accustomed to finding patterns in large amounts of information. He created spreadsheets of witnesses, timelines of Marcus's last known movements, maps marking every location that had been searched. Jennifer worried that her husband's fascination with the case was becoming unhealthy, but she understood it as his way of processing their new environment, of trying to make sense of the tragedy that had shaped their neighborhood. She also noticed that his research was conducted with genuine respect for the Chen family's privacy. He never approached them directly, never tried to interview neighbors about their memories of that day, never did anything that might reopen wounds that were still healing. Instead, Michael focused on publicly available information, spending his lunch breaks and evening hours after the girls were in bed, reading through case files, studying photographs, trying to understand how such a thorough investigation could have yielded so few answers. He was particularly struck by the witnesses who had seen Marcus on his walk home that day. Mrs. Hartwell had seen him pass her house at 3:42 p.m. A crossing guard at Pine Street and Elm Avenue had noted him crossing the street at approximately 3:38 p.m. A mail carrier remembered seeing him walking along Pine Street at about 3:35 p.m. What fascinated Michael was the precision of these sightings and the clear timeline they established. Marcus had been following his usual route home, maintaining his normal pace, showing no signs of distress or deviation from his routine. But somewhere between Mrs. Hartwell's house at 3:42 p.m. and his own front door, which should have taken him no more than 3 or 4 minutes to reach, Marcus had simply vanished. Michael walked the route himself many times, timing how long it took, noting every possible turnoff, every alley or driveway where someone might have encountered Marcus without being seen. He observed the neighborhood's rhythms at different times of day, paying attention to when people were typically home, when children were playing outside, when the streets were busiest. He began to understand how in the few minutes between 3:42 and 3:46 p.m. on that October afternoon, someone could have approached Marcus in the one small stretch of Millbrook Avenue that wasn't visible from any house windows. But understanding how it could have happened wasn't the same as understanding what had happened. Michael's analysis confirmed what the police had concluded 15 years earlier. Marcus had vanished during a very narrow window of time in a very specific location under circumstances that suggested either careful planning or extraordinary opportunity. But knowing this didn't bring him any closer to knowing who was responsible or what had become of the boy. As autumn approached, the season that had witnessed Marcus's disappearance, Michael found his thoughts turning more frequently to the case. He had developed a routine of walking the neighborhood in the early morning hours before his family woke up, ostensibly for exercise, but really to observe the streets and houses with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. He noticed which neighbors kept regular schedules, which houses had good sightlines to the street, which areas were more secluded than others. It was during one of these morning walks that Michael first noticed something unusual about 267 Millbrook Avenue, a modest ranch house that sat at the end of the street, where it dead-ended into Millbrook Park. The house was owned by an elderly man named Robert Brennan, who had lived there since the 1980s, according to the neighborhood directory. Mr. Brennan was a widower, a retired maintenance supervisor who kept to himself but was generally regarded as a harmless, if somewhat reclusive, member of the community. What caught Michael's attention wasn't anything obviously suspicious about Mr. Brennan or his property. It was something much more subtle, a pattern of behavior that seemed oddly consistent and purposeful. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., Mr. Brennan would emerge from his house and walk to the end of his driveway to retrieve his newspaper. This was normal enough. Many people had similar routines. But after collecting his paper, Mr. Brennan would always pause and look up and down the street in a way that seemed more than casual. He would stand there for exactly 2 minutes, scanning the neighborhood with what appeared to be systematic thoroughness before returning to his house. The routine never varied. Michael had observed it more than a dozen times, and it was always the same. 7:15 a.m., retrieve the paper, 2 minutes of careful observation, return inside. On weekends, when there was no paper delivery, Mr. Brennan would still emerge at 7:15 a.m., walk to the end of his driveway, conduct his 2-minute survey of the street and go back inside. Michael Walsh's observation of Robert Brennan's morning routine had started as idle curiosity, the kind of small mystery that captures the mind during early morning walks when the world is quiet and details seem more significant than they might at other times of day. But as the weeks passed and the pattern remained absolutely consistent, 7:15 a.m., retrieve the newspaper, 2 minutes of methodical street observation, return inside, Michael began to feel that he was witnessing something more deliberate than the simple habits of an elderly man. It wasn't just the precise timing that struck him as unusual, though that was certainly part of it. In Michael's experience, most people's routines had some natural variation. Traffic might make someone a few minutes late leaving for work. A phone call might interrupt their morning schedule. Weather might cause them to hurry or linger. But Robert Brennan's routine seemed immune to these normal fluctuations. Rain or shine, weekday or weekend, the pattern never deviated. More intriguing was the quality of Brennan's attention during those 2 minutes of observation. Michael had studied the man's behavior from various vantage points during his morning walks, and what he saw didn't look like someone casually checking the weather or noting which neighbors were up early. Brennan's gaze was systematic, methodical. He would start by looking left toward the main part of Millbrook Avenue, then slowly scan right toward the park, then back again. His focus seemed particularly drawn to the houses where children lived, and Michael noticed that Brennan paid special attention to the Chen house at 247, often staring at it for longer than seemed natural. This observation sparked something uncomfortable in Michael's mind. He began to pay closer attention to Brennan's other activities, not out of malicious suspicion, but with the growing sense that something about the man's behavior deserved scrutiny. Michael started varying the timing and route of his morning walks, approaching from different directions so he could observe Brennan without being noticed himself. What he discovered was that Brennan's vigilance extended beyond his morning routine. Throughout the day, Michael would catch glimpses of the man at his windows, always positioned where he could observe the street. When children walked home from school, Brennan was often visible in his living room window, watching. When neighbors worked in their yards or walked their dogs, he seemed to be monitoring their activities from behind partially closed curtains. Michael tried to convince himself that this was normal behavior for an elderly, possibly lonely widower. Many older residents kept track of neighborhood activities. It was a way of staying connected to their community, of feeling useful and informed. Mrs. Hartwell, after all, had been working in her garden when she saw Marcus for the last time, and no one considered her vigilance suspicious. But there was something different about Brennan's watching, something that felt less like community engagement and more like surveillance. The more Michael observed, the more questions arose in his mind. He learned from Mrs. Patterson that Brennan had lived at 267 Millbrook Avenue since 1984, which meant he had been a neighborhood resident for more than 20 years when Marcus disappeared. He had been interviewed by police like everyone else on the street, but Michael couldn't find any record of what he had told them, or whether he had provided any useful information about that October afternoon. Michael began to research Brennan's background, using the same methodical approach he had applied to studying Marcus's case. Public records showed that Robert Brennan was 73 years old, a retired maintenance supervisor for the Eastfield School District. He had been married to Dorothy Brennan for 42 years before her death from cancer in 2003. They had no children of their own, though Dorothy had apparently been devoted to her work as a substitute teacher and had volunteered with several youth organizations over the years. On the surface, Brennan's life appeared unremarkable. He owned his house outright, paid his taxes on time, had no criminal record that Michael could find. His neighbors described him as quiet, but not unfriendly, someone who kept his property neat and didn't cause any problems. Several people mentioned that he had seemed to become more reclusive after his wife's death, but this was understandable, given his grief and advancing age. Yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about Brennan's behavior. The morning routine, the constant observation of the neighborhood, the particular attention paid to houses with children, it all felt like the behavior of someone who was watching and waiting, though for what, Michael couldn't say. His research into the case had taught him that many child abductions are committed by people who are known to the victim, or at least familiar to the community. Strangers who snatch children at random are relatively rare. More common are predators who study their targets, learn their routines, wait for the right opportunity. The fact that Marcus had vanished so completely, with no witnesses and no physical evidence, suggested that whoever was responsible had planned carefully and knew the neighborhood well. Michael found himself wondering what Robert Brennan had been doing on October 17, 2006, at approximately 3:45 p.m. According to the police reports he had read, Brennan had been interviewed 3 days after Marcus's disappearance. He had told investigators that he was inside his house at the time watching television and hadn't noticed anything unusual that afternoon. This seemed plausible, even likely. But Michael wondered if anyone had asked Brennan about his typical routine, whether investigators had understood that this was a man who made it his business to observe everything that happened on Millbrook Avenue. As October approached, The 15th anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, Michael felt a growing urgency about his suspicions. He knew that he might be seeing patterns that didn't exist, reading significance into behaviors that were perfectly innocent. The human mind, he understood, was remarkably good at finding connections even where none existed, especially when it was actively looking for them. But he also knew that his background in data analysis had taught him to trust patterns when they were consistent and significant. Brennan's behavior wasn't random. It was systematic, purposeful, and had apparently been going on for years. The question was whether this behavior was connected to Marcus's disappearance or simply the quirks of an aging man who had found comfort in routine and observation. Michael decided he needed to know more about what Brennan did inside his house, particularly in areas that weren't visible from the street. The ranch-style home sat on a corner lot with good visibility in most directions, but like all houses, it had blind spots. The backyard was fenced and largely hidden from neighboring properties by mature evergreen trees that had grown tall over the decades. There was also a basement. Michael could see the small windows that indicated a below-ground level, though they were positioned high enough that it would be difficult to see inside, even if you were standing directly next to them. The basement windows bothered Michael in a way he couldn't quite articulate. They were always dark, never showing any sign of light or activity, despite the fact that Brennan seemed to spend most of his waking hours somewhere in the house. Most people used their basements for storage, laundry, workshops, or recreation rooms. Even if Brennan didn't use his basement regularly, Michael would have expected to see occasional signs of activity, lights going on when he retrieved something from storage, or the glow of a television if he had set up a den down there. Michael began to time his walks to coincide with different parts of Brennan's day, trying to map out the man's movements within his house. He could see into the living room and kitchen from certain angles on the street, and he noticed that Brennan seemed to spend most of his time in these visible areas during the day. But there were long periods, particularly in the late afternoon and evening, when the visible portions of the house appeared empty, despite Brennan's car being in the driveway. This observation led Michael to a troubling possibility. What if Brennan was spending significant amounts of time in the basement, in the one part of his house that was completely hidden from outside view? And if so, what was he doing down there that required such privacy and consistency? Michael knew he was crossing a line from legitimate curiosity into something that could be considered stalking or harassment. He had no evidence that Robert Brennan had done anything wrong, no justification for the surveillance he was conducting beyond his own growing suspicions. But the 15th anniversary of Marcus's disappearance was approaching, and Michael felt a responsibility to at least consider the possibility that the answer to the neighborhood's greatest mystery might be living at the end of their street. He decided to share his observations with Jennifer, hoping that she might help him determine whether his suspicions had merit or whether he was allowing his fascination with the case to cloud his judgment. They talked late into the night after their daughters were asleep, with Michael laying out his observations, and Jennifer asking the hard questions he had been avoiding. "But what are you actually suggesting?" she asked, her voice quiet but direct. "That this elderly man has been hiding something about Marcus for 15 years? That no one else has noticed these patterns you're seeing?" Michael struggled to articulate his concerns in a way that didn't sound paranoid or accusatory. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive," he said. "I'm just saying that there's a pattern here that doesn't feel normal to me. The constant watching, the rigid routine, the way he pays special attention to houses with children. And the timing. He was here when Marcus disappeared. He was interviewed by police, but I wonder if they asked the right questions." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, she said, "What would you want to do about it? You can't exactly knock on his door and ask him what he does in his basement, and you certainly can't call the police based on the fact that an old man has a routine and looks out his windows." This was the question Michael had been wrestling with for weeks. What could he do with his suspicions that wouldn't be invasive, inappropriate, or potentially harmful to an innocent person? He wasn't a police officer. He had no authority to investigate anything. He was just a neighbor who had noticed patterns that made him uncomfortable. "I keep thinking about Detective Martinez," Michael said. "She's still working on the case, even after all these years. Maybe I should talk to her, just to share what I've observed. Let someone with actual experience and authority decide whether it's worth looking into. Jennifer nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Better than you trying to investigate on your own. She paused, then added, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that she'll tell you there's nothing there, that you're seeing connections that don't exist. Michael understood this, but he also knew that he wouldn't be able to let go of his suspicions without at least sharing them with someone who could evaluate them professionally. The next morning, he called the Eastfield Police Department and asked to speak with Detective Martinez about the Marcus Chen case. Detective Sarah Martinez, now Lieutenant Martinez, had fielded hundreds of calls about the Marcus Chen case over the 15 years since the boy's disappearance. Most came from well-meaning citizens who thought they had spotted him in shopping malls or airports, from psychics offering to channel information from beyond, or from armchair detectives who had developed elaborate theories about what had happened that October afternoon. She had learned to listen patiently to each caller while managing her expectations about the likelihood that any particular tip would lead somewhere meaningful. But Michael Walsh's call was different. His voice carried the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of what he was suggesting, and his observations were specific, documented, and presented without dramatic speculation. When he described Robert Brennan's rigid daily routine and constant surveillance of the neighborhood, Martinez found herself taking notes with the kind of attention she hadn't given to a Marcus Chen tip in years. Mr. Walsh, she said after listening to his complete account, I need to ask you directly, are you suggesting that Mr. Brennan was involved in Marcus's disappearance? Michael chose his words carefully. I'm not suggesting anything specific, Lieutenant. I'm just reporting behavior that strikes me as unusual and potentially relevant. Mr. Brennan has lived on this street for 37 years. He was here when Marcus disappeared. He clearly pays very close attention to everything that happens in the neighborhood, particularly involving children. I think it might be worth talking to him again, especially since 15 years have passed since his original interview. Martinez reviewed her notes from the original investigation. Robert Brennan had indeed been interviewed on October 20th, 2006, 3 days after Marcus's disappearance. Detective Patricia Reeves had spoken with him for approximately 20 minutes at his home. According to her report, Brennan had been cooperative but had provided no useful information. He claimed to have been inside his house watching television at the time of Marcus's disappearance and said he hadn't noticed anything unusual that afternoon. Looking at the report with 15 years of hindsight, Martinez realized that the original interview had been relatively superficial. Like many of the witness interviews conducted during those first frantic days, it had focused on whether Brennan had seen or heard anything specific on October 17th, rather than exploring his general knowledge of the neighborhood or his typical daily activities. Given the massive scope of the initial investigation, this approach had been understandable, but it meant that potentially relevant information might have been overlooked. Martinez decided to pay a visit to Michael Walsh before taking any action regarding Brennan. She wanted to see the man's documentation firsthand and get a better sense of his credibility. Over the years, she had developed a good instinct for distinguishing between legitimate concerns and conspiracy theories, and she needed to evaluate which category Michael's observations fell into. Michael met her at a coffee shop in downtown Eastfield, bringing with him a folder containing photographs, maps, and timelines he had created during his months of observation. Martinez was impressed by the thoroughness of his documentation and the restrained way he presented his findings. He wasn't claiming to have solved the case or making wild accusations. He was simply pointing out patterns that had caught his attention and suggesting that they might warrant professional review. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, Martinez said, studying the detailed timeline Michael had created of Brennan's daily routine. But I have to ask, why? What made you focus on Mr. Brennan specifically? Michael had anticipated this question and had given it considerable thought. Honestly, it started almost by accident. I walk early in the morning, and I began noticing his routine just because it was so precise. But the more I observed, the more it seemed like the behavior of someone who was watching, rather than just looking. And given what happened to Marcus, and the fact that Brennan has such a clear view of where that happened, it felt like something that should be documented. Martinez appreciated his honesty and his acknowledgement that his suspicions might be unfounded. Too many amateur investigators presented their theories as established fact rather than as possibilities worth exploring. Michael's approach suggested that he understood the difference between observation and conclusion, which made his information more credible. After reviewing all of Michael's documentation, Martinez decided that his observations warranted a fresh conversation with Robert Brennan. She wouldn't approach it as an accusatory interview, but rather as a follow-up discussion that might yield information that had been missed 15 years earlier. Her experience had taught her that witnesses sometimes remembered details years later that they hadn't thought significant at the time, and that different questions could elicit different responses. She decided to visit Brennan at his home, as she had done with dozens of other witnesses over the years when new information or fresh perspectives suggested that a second conversation might be productive. She planned to approach the visit as a routine follow-up, rather than as the investigation of a suspect, both because she had no evidence of wrongdoing and because a confrontational approach might cause Brennan to become defensive or uncooperative. On a grey Thursday morning in late October, almost exactly 15 years after Marcus's disappearance, Martinez drove to 267 Millbrook Avenue. The house looked much as it had in 2006, though the landscaping showed signs of an aging owner's reduced attention to maintenance. The lawn was neatly mowed, but the flower beds contained more weeds than flowers, and the paint on the shutters had begun to peel. Martinez rang the doorbell at 10:30 a.m., a time she hoped would find Brennan at home but alert. She heard movement inside the house, then a long pause before the door opened to reveal a thin, elderly man with carefully combed grey hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her appearance. "Mr. Brennan? I'm Lieutenant Martinez with the Eastfield Police Department. I was hoping I could speak with you for a few minutes about the Marcus Chen case." Brennan's expression didn't change, but Martinez noticed that he gripped the doorframe slightly tighter. "So of course," he said, "though I'm not sure what more I can tell you than I did 15 years ago. Sometimes people remember details later that didn't seem important at the time," Martinez explained. "And I wanted to ask you about your knowledge of the neighborhood in general, not just about that specific day." Brennan stepped aside to let her enter, and Martinez found herself in a living room that felt frozen in time. The furniture appeared to be from the 1980s, the decor unchanged since his wife's death. But what struck her most was how the room was arranged to provide an excellent view of Millbrook Avenue through the large front window. A chair was positioned directly facing the street, with a side table that held binoculars, a notepad, and a pen. "You keep a close eye on the neighborhood," Martinez observed, nodding toward the window setup. Brennan followed her gaze and shrugged. "When you get to be my age and you're here by yourself most of the time, watching the world go by becomes a form of entertainment. Nothing wrong with that." "Of course not," Martinez agreed. "I imagine you notice a lot of things that other people miss. Patterns, changes in routine, anything unusual." "I suppose I do," Brennan said, settling into the chair facing the window. Martinez noticed that even during their conversation, his eyes frequently drifted to the street outside. Martinez spent the next 45 minutes talking with Brennan about his observations of the neighborhood, his memories of the day Marcus disappeared, and his general knowledge of the families who lived on Millbrook Avenue. Brennan was cooperative and seemed genuinely interested in helping, but Martinez detected something carefully controlled about his responses. He answered her questions directly, but didn't volunteer additional information, and she had the sense that he was thinking carefully about each answer before speaking. When she asked about his activities on the afternoon of October 17, 2006, Brennan repeated essentially the same account he had given 15 years earlier. He had been inside watching television, hadn't noticed anything unusual, hadn't seen Marcus that day at all. But when Martinez asked about his general routine during that time period, Brennan's answers became less specific. "I'm sure I was doing the same things I always do," he said, "taking care of the house, watching some TV, maybe working in the yard if the weather was nice." "Do you remember if you spent any time in your basement that afternoon?" Martinez asked, the question prompted by Michael's observations about the consistently dark basement windows. For the first time during the interview, Brennan seemed genuinely surprised by a question. "My basement? Why would you ask about that?" "Just trying to get a complete picture of where everyone was and what they were doing," Martinez said casually. "Do you use your basement much?" "Not really," Brennan said. "Just for storage mostly. I don't go down there very often." But Martinez noticed that his eyes had stopped drifting to the window and were now focused intently on her face, as if he was trying to understand the purpose behind her questions. As the interview concluded, Martinez thanked Brennan for his time and left her card, asking him to call if he remembered anything else that might be helpful. She had the feeling that the conversation had been productive, though not in ways she could easily define. Brennan had been cooperative and had answered all her questions, but something about his responses felt incomplete, as if he was editing his answers before speaking them. Walking back to her car, Martinez noticed that the basement windows Michael had mentioned were indeed dark and reflected no light from inside. She also observed that the basement appeared to be larger than she would have expected for a ranch house of this size, extending under what seemed to be the entire footprint of the building. 3 days after Lieutenant Martinez's visit to Robert Brennan, Michael Walsh woke to the sound of sirens wailing down Millbrook Avenue. It was 6:30 a.m., earlier than his usual morning walk, but the urgent sound of emergency vehicles drew him to his bedroom window. Through the grey dawn light, he could see police cars and an ambulance gathered at the end of the street, their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in stark, alarming colors. Michael dressed quickly and walked toward the commotion, his heart racing with the possibility that his observations about Brennan had somehow led to this dramatic response. But as he drew closer, he realized that the emergency vehicles were not at 267 Millbrook Avenue. They were positioned outside the house next door, where elderly Mrs. Kowalski lived alone since her husband's death 2 years earlier. Mrs. Kowalski had apparently suffered a heart attack during the night and had been discovered by her home health aide when she arrived for her morning visit. The paramedics were loading her into the ambulance as Michael approached, and neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity on their normally quiet street. As Michael watched the ambulance pull away, he noticed Robert Brennan standing in his front yard, observing the scene with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else in the neighborhood. But there was something different about Brennan's demeanor this morning. He seemed agitated, more alert than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the growing crowd of neighbors and the police officers who remained to file their report. Michael positioned himself where he could observe Brennan without being obvious about it, and what he saw troubled him. While other neighbors were focused on Mrs. Kowalski's house and expressing concern about her condition, Brennan's attention kept returning to the police officers. He watched their movements with what appeared to be intense focus, and when one of the officers walked toward the end of the street, Brennan quickly retreated into his house. The emergency had created unusual activity on Millbrook Avenue for the rest of the morning. Mrs. Kowalski's daughter arrived from Hartford, neighbors stopped by to offer help or information, and a locksmith was called to secure the house while she was in the hospital. Michael used this activity as cover to observe Brennan's property more closely than he had been able to do during his regular walks. What he noticed was that Brennan's routine had been completely disrupted by the morning's events. The man who had emerged from his house at exactly 7:15 every morning for months was nowhere to be seen. The newspaper lay uncollected at the end of his driveway, and his house appeared empty despite his car being in the garage. Michael decided to walk around the block, approaching Brennan's property from different angles, to see if he could determine where the man might be. As he passed the side of the house, something caught his eye that he had never noticed before. There was a set of concrete steps leading down to what appeared to be an exterior basement entrance, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs and positioned on the side of the house that faced away from the street. The basement entrance was secured by a heavy wooden door that looked much newer than the rest of the house's exterior features. Unlike the weathered siding and aging trim elsewhere, this door appeared to have been installed or refinished recently. There was also a substantial deadbolt lock, the kind typically used for securing valuable property, rather than simple storage areas. Michael felt his pulse quicken as he considered the implications of what he was seeing. Brennan had told Lieutenant Martinez that he rarely used his basement, that it was just for storage. But the condition of this entrance suggested regular use, and the quality of the lock indicated that whatever was stored down there was considered valuable or important enough to require serious security. As Michael stood studying the basement entrance, he heard the sound of movement from inside the house. Through a small window, he could see a figure moving around in what appeared to be the kitchen. Brennan was clearly home, despite giving no outward signs of activity. Michael quickly moved away from the side of the house, not wanting to be caught spying on his neighbor's property. But the image of that basement door stayed with him for the rest of the day. Everything about it seemed inconsistent with Brennan's claim that the basement was rarely used storage space. The new door, the heavy lock, the careful concealment behind overgrown vegetation, it all suggested a level of attention and security that didn't match a simple storage area. That evening, Michael called Lieutenant Martinez and described what he had observed during the morning's emergency activity. He was careful to emphasize that he hadn't been deliberately spying on Brennan, but had simply noticed things while the unusual activity on the street provided a reason to be in the area. Martinez listened carefully to his description of the basement entrance. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "I want you to promise me something. Don't go near that property again. Don't try to look in windows or investigate anything else about Mr. Brennan. If there's something there that needs to be found, we'll find it. But I need you to step back and let us handle this professionally." Michael agreed, but Martinez could hear the excitement in his voice. She understood it, the possibility that they might be close to answers about Marcus Chen after 15 years was intoxicating. But she also knew that amateur investigation could compromise any potential evidence or worse, put Michael in danger if his suspicions proved correct. After ending the call with Michael, Martinez spent a long time thinking about next steps. She had enough circumstantial evidence to justify a more thorough investigation of Robert Brennan, but not nearly enough for a search warrant. Brennan's behavior patterns, the inconsistencies in his statements about the basement, and the discovery of the secured exterior entrance all added up to reasonable suspicion, but courts required more than suspicion to authorize searches of private property. Martinez decided to conduct some additional background research on Brennan before deciding how to proceed. She requested his employment records from the Eastfield School District, where he had worked as a maintenance supervisor for nearly 30 years before retiring. She also asked for any reports of suspicious activity or complaints that might have been filed against him during his employment. What she discovered in Brennan's employment file made her decide that more aggressive investigation was warranted. While his overall record was clean, there had been 2 incidents during his career that had resulted in informal complaints. In 1994, a teacher had reported that Brennan had been found in her classroom after hours without a work order or apparent reason for being there. In 1999, a parent had complained that Brennan had been asking their child questions about their daily routine and after-school activities that seemed inappropriate for a maintenance worker. Neither incident had resulted in formal disciplinary action, and both had been resolved with verbal warnings about appropriate workplace behavior. But taken together with what Martinez now knew about Brennan's observation of neighborhood children, these reports suggested a pattern of inappropriate interest that had persisted for decades. Martinez decided it was time to involve the FBI again. The Bureau had worked on the Marcus Chen case extensively during the first 2 years after his disappearance, and Agent David Kim, who had been the lead federal investigator, was still active and still periodically reviewed cold cases from his caseload. Martinez called Agent Kim and briefed him on the new information about Robert Brennan. Agent Kim was immediately interested. "I remember interviewing Brennan in 2006, he said. "He struck me as someone who was holding something back, but we had no reason to press him at the time. If you think there's enough here to justify a closer look, I can help you get the resources you need." Over the next week, Martinez and Agent Kim worked together to build a case for obtaining a search warrant for Brennan's property. They compiled all the circumstantial evidence, documented the inconsistencies in his statements, and researched legal precedents for searches based on similar circumstances. They also arranged for surveillance of Brennan's property to document his activities and look for any additional evidence that might support their case. The surveillance team observed Brennan for 5 days, noting his rigid routine and his constant observation of the neighborhood. They also confirmed Michael's observation about the basement. While lights were frequently visible in the main floor of the house, the basement windows remained dark even during the evening hours when Brennan appeared to be active somewhere in the building. On November 3rd, exactly 2 weeks after Michael's call to Martinez, a judge signed a search warrant for 267 Millbrook Avenue and all structures on the property, including the basement and any outbuildings. The warrant authorized a complete search for evidence related to the disappearance of Marcus Chen, as well as any evidence of other crimes that might be discovered during the search. Martinez assembled a team that included Agent Kim, 2 other FBI specialists, a crime scene photographer, and a forensics expert who specialized in cold cases. They also arranged for a locksmith to be available in case they encountered security measures that required professional bypass, and for a counselor to be present in case they discovered evidence that would require immediate notification of the Chen family. The search was scheduled for the following morning at 7 a.m., 15 minutes before Brennan's usual routine would bring him outside to collect his newspaper. Martinez wanted to catch him inside the house before he had a chance to observe their approach and potentially destroy evidence or take any other action that might compromise their investigation. As she prepared for what might be the most important search of her career, Martinez found herself thinking about Marcus Chen, not as a case file or a cold case statistic, but as a 12-year-old boy who had been walking home from school on a beautiful October afternoon 15 years ago. If Robert Brennan had taken that boy, if he had kept him somewhere, if there were answers to be found in that basement with its consistently dark windows and heavy security, then tomorrow might finally bring the truth that Marcus's family had been waiting for all these years. At 7 a.m. on November 4th, Lieutenant Martinez and her team positioned themselves around Robert Brennan's property as the autumn sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Avenue. The street was quiet, most residents still preparing for their morning routines, unaware that the mystery that had haunted their neighborhood for 15 years might finally be approaching its resolution. Martinez approached the front door, while Agent Kim and the other officers took positions around the house to prevent any possible escape. She could see Brennan moving around inside through the kitchen window, apparently making his morning coffee, unaware of the law enforcement presence gathering outside his home. The knock on the door was firm, but not aggressive. Martinez wanted to control the situation without creating unnecessary drama that might alert the neighborhood before they knew what they were dealing with. She heard Brennan's footsteps approaching the door, then a long pause as he presumably looked through the peephole and saw her standing there with other officers visible behind her. When the door opened, Brennan's face showed no surprise, only a kind of weary resignation that suggested he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "I suppose this is about Marcus," he said quietly, stepping aside to allow the officers to enter. "We have a warrant to search your property, Mr. Brennan," Martinez said, showing him the document. "Please have a seat in your living room while we conduct our search." As the team began their systematic examination of the house, Martinez stayed with Brennan in the living room. She noticed that he positioned himself in his usual chair facing the window, but his attention was focused inward rather than on the street outside. His hands were folded carefully in his lap, and he had the appearance of someone who was mentally preparing himself for an inevitable conversation. "Would you like to tell me what we're going to find here, Mr. Brennan?" Martinez asked gently. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the window that only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but filled with something that might have been relief. "You're going to find my workshop," he said. "In the basement. That's where I kept him." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Martinez felt her heart racing as she processed what Brennan had just admitted. After 15 years of questions, of theories, of searches that led nowhere. The answer had been here all along, in the basement of a house at the end of Millbrook Avenue. "Is Marcus still there?" Martinez asked, her voice carefully controlled. Brennan shook his head slowly. "No. He died about a week after I brought him home. I didn't mean for that to happen. I never meant to hurt him." Martinez signaled to Agent Kim, who immediately radioed for the medical examiner and additional forensic support. The confirmation that they were dealing with a homicide rather than a kidnapping changed the scope of their investigation and the resources they would need. "I'd like you to tell me what happened, Mr. Brennan," Martinez said. "Starting from the beginning." Over the next 2 hours, as the forensics team worked in the basement below them, Robert Brennan told the story he had kept hidden for 15 years. His account was detailed, methodical, and delivered with the same careful precision he had applied to everything else in his life. It was also one of the most disturbing confessions Martinez had heard in her 20-year career. Brennan explained that he had been watching Marcus for months before October 17, 2006. He had learned the boy's routine, his timing, his habits. He knew that Marcus walked home alone, that there was a brief stretch of Millbrook Avenue where he wouldn't be visible from any house windows, and that his parents wouldn't expect him home for several minutes after he passed that point. "I had been planning it for a long time," Brennan said. "Not specifically Marcus, but someone like him. I had been preparing the basement for years, getting everything ready. When Dorothy died, I knew I was going to need company." Brennan described how he had approached Marcus that afternoon, claiming that there was an injured cat in his backyard that needed help. Marcus, who had always been taught to be helpful and had no reason to fear an elderly neighbor, had followed Brennan into his yard and then into his house through the back door. "I had chloroform," Brennan said. "I put him to sleep and carried him downstairs. When he woke up, he was in the room I had prepared for him." The room Brennan had prepared was revealed by the forensics team to be a furnished basement space with soundproofed walls, a locked door, and no windows. It contained a bed, a small table and chair, some books and toys, and a chemical toilet. It had been designed to hold someone for an extended period while preventing any sound from escaping to the outside world. "I told him his parents had been in an accident and that he was going to stay with me until they got better," Brennan continued. I thought he would adjust. I thought he would come to see me as someone who was taking care of him." But Marcus had never adjusted. He had cried constantly, had refused to eat, had begged to go home to his parents. Brennan, who had fantasized about having a child to care for and to keep him company, found that the reality was nothing like what he had imagined. "He got sick," Brennan said. "He wouldn't eat much, and he was so upset all the time. I tried to get him medicine, but I couldn't take him to a doctor. By the end of the first week, he had a fever and he was having trouble breathing. He died during the night on October 24th. Martinez had to step outside for a moment to compose herself. The image of 12-year-old Marcus Chen, trapped in a basement prison, sick and frightened and calling for his parents, was almost unbearable. She thought about Linda and David Chen, who had spent 15 years hoping their son might still be alive somewhere, and realized that she would soon have to tell them that their worst fears had been reality. When she returned, Brennan continued his confession, describing how he had buried Marcus's body in the basement, beneath a concrete floor he had poured himself. He had kept the basement room largely intact, he said, because he had been planning to find another child to bring home. But as the years passed and the investigation continued, he had become too frightened to act on his plans. "I kept watching the neighborhood," he said. "I knew when new families moved in, which houses had children, what their routines were. I was always looking for another opportunity, but after what happened with Marcus, I was too scared, too guilty." The forensic team confirmed Brennan's account when they discovered Marcus's remains beneath the basement floor, along with personal items that had been in his backpack on the day he disappeared. His math homework, his lunchbox, the Revolutionary War report that had been his last school assignment. The preservation of these items allowed for positive identification and provided physical evidence to support Brennan's confession. As news of the arrest spread through the neighborhood, the reaction was a complex mixture of relief, horror, and profound sadness. The Chen family, who had been notified by Martinez before the news became public, released a statement thanking law enforcement for never giving up on their son's case while asking for privacy, as they processed the devastating confirmation of what had happened to Marcus. Michael Walsh, whose observations had ultimately led to the discovery, felt a complicated mix of vindication and regret. He was glad that the truth had finally been revealed, but he struggled with the knowledge that Marcus had been so close, suffering in a basement less than 100 yards from where Michael now lived, while the neighborhood went about its daily life, unaware of the horror that was taking place. Mrs. Hartwell, now 85, maintained her memorial garden, but added a new element, a small stone marker that simply read, "Marcus Chen, home at last." She told reporters that she had always believed Marcus would come home eventually, and while this wasn't the homecoming anyone had hoped for, it was still a form of peace. Robert Brennan was charged with kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he addressed the Chen family directly, apologizing for what he had done to their son and to their family. His words were met with silence from Linda and David Chen, who attended the hearing but chose not to make victim impact statements. The case officially closed on December 15, 2021, exactly 15 years and 2 months after Marcus Chen had vanished from Millbrook Avenue. In her final report, Lieutenant Martinez noted that the solution had come not from new forensic technology or fresh investigative techniques, but from the careful observations of a neighbor who had noticed patterns that seemed worth questioning. The house at 267 Millbrook Avenue was sold by Brennan's estate and subsequently demolished by the new owners, who built a small park on the site with benches and flowering trees. A plaque near the entrance reads simply, "In memory of Marcus Chen and all children who have been lost." On quiet mornings when the autumn light filters through the maple trees that still line Millbrook Avenue, neighbors sometimes pause at the small park and remember the boy who had waved to Mrs. Hartwell on his way home from school, never knowing that he would become part of the neighborhood's permanent memory. His story serves as both a reminder of innocence lost and a testament to the power of community attention, of neighbors who care enough to notice when something doesn't seem right, and of the importance of never giving up hope that truth, however painful, will eventually find its way to light. The mystery that had haunted Millbrook Avenue for 15 years was finally solved, but its resolution brought not joy, but a complex mixture of closure and grief. Marcus Chen was home at last, and his family could finally begin the different kind of healing that comes with knowing the truth, even when that truth is more terrible than any of the possibilities they had imagined during the long years of waiting and wondering.